Good morning, everyone. World's main stage is coming up October 3rd, Swiss stage. And before we really get into those matchups, we need to talk about the play-in meta and what has changed. So prior to this, 14-16 playoffs meta and all that, we had in the jungle, basically Sejuani, Maokai, Ivern, Vi as the dominant four. Then we had Lilia and Brand. Brand specifically was a Chinese pick, LPL. Lilia was more dominated in LCK, LCS, EU, and then sometimes Nidalee. And Nidalee was mostly for teams who were good at invading and playing that kind of style. Now, with the mid lane picks, because there was like APs thrown in and control picks, we still had a very heavily dominated Tristana, Corki, Yone, Azir, and then outside of that, you could throw in some other picks, LeBlanc at times. But that was pretty much it. In top lane, it was the Rumble show, right? It was the Rumble show. That champion was insanely OP and was preferred in many drafts as the 1P choice. Then we had Renekton and Cassante, and outside of that, it's like a little bit of Jax, a bit of Gnar, and yeah, that was pretty much it. Sometimes Kennen. In the bot lane, it's the Ziggs show. LPL didn't favor that as much, but Ashe, MF, and Ezreal were huge priorities, and you could toss in a little bit of Jhin. And then for bot lane, it was the Rel. The Rel was a huge priority, like the clear standouts support pick. And then outside of Rel, it just kind of fell through like whatever melee support you wanted or felt suited your draft. There's very little range supports included in these situations. Some people experimented with Kalista Senna, but that kind of died out pretty fast. And that was about it. Aurora was globally banned, so due to that, she didn't really get much play at all. It did happen in NACL and also in the Battle of Americas a bit. She took some decent nerfs, but if you can flex her and play her in top lane, she's a very annoying and like lethal pick. So we're gonna have better players in top lane who can use that, which this will be probably the Joker pick of the tournament, or at least in the initial days as we kind of gauge how all this goes, because if these teams do flex it and figure her out, yeah, she is legit. And I mean, this could definitely just turn into a higher pick ban percentage. We'll have to see. But based on what the patches have done, with the nerfs to Lilia and Brand, with the nerfs to Corki, to Azir hitting laning phase nerfs that are pretty rough, and he doesn't really recover it ever, but like specifically it just like kind of hurts his impact of duel, which sucks. And I do think he's still playable. And the thing with Trist is that naturally the way they did Trist is that her priority should raise up, but you can still play Azir plus Corki into this. And then naturally, because of Mercs, being 1200 and yada yada yada, with like some of these AP picks, like Ori and like Syndra and whatever, these are not as actually enjoyable for Trist to play into, even Hui to a degree, because again, Mercs got nerfed, and if these picks are also getting buffs to their itemization with Storm Surge and Ludens, yeah, even though she should be a higher priority, what she has to face in the playing field ends up making her not nearly as good. And so really the only AD champion who's escaping these situations that turns out to be a rather good pick across the board is Yone. So Yone becomes the premier AD pick in the meta, and then we basically have mages. That is like the direction we're going with the meta. We have 80 junglers, because Jarvan got a nice solid buff. That's why we see Jarvan being up. And of course, if mages are being picked more, we have more bot laners who are more prone to being like played on. Naturally, Jarvan rises up. And of course, if you're playing an enchanter support, you need engage. Jarvan's there. Naturally, with Jarvan rising up, then you have Wukong. Vi's still in there. We still have Skarner. So we have 80 junglers and control junglers. And don't get me wrong, we do still from time to time have AP junglers. But it's not very well done. Like, you kind of like depend on this being your pick in the end of the day for AD or Trist if it does in fact look good, but it's not exactly meta, you know? I think this would only work in some cases where like you're running Ivern with something like that, and then you have maybe like an Ornn top with a good matchup like Ornn into Renekton or whatever, and then that can work. But we haven't seen that yet. And naturally, like I said, you see the Central priority. It has risen up a lot. Akali, this is also in part due to Yone, but also she has good standard buffs. So that this makes sense. This makes sense on how play-ins is going to be reflected into the main stage. For top lane, Rumble took significant nerfs. Jax got very good buffs, and with a lot of good Jax players, this will become a thing. Renekton, you know? We have still Renekton, very solid pick. We still have Cassante, very solid pick. And then things kind of get a little weirder, and it just depends on how you want to face it out. Like, some people might play Urgot, you know what I mean? Some people might play Cho'Gath, though this was more of a thing I saw in NACL than anything else. How the world's meta shapes around these three picks will matter a lot. And then Rumble is like on the side. He's still not a bad pick. You can definitely play him, but he's not as blindable. So his pick ban percentage should go down. And then in bot lane, naturally you see these two. These champions were mostly untouched, if not touched at all from the patches. So they're going to be really good. They're going to be very high priorities across the board. When Ashe is removed, then you're going to see things like Kalista pop up more. And since lane swaps are not nerfed enough either, Ziggs is still a very solid pick because he goes TP in these situations, which is fantastic. And keep in mind, MF and Ezreal both took nerfs. Ezreal was one of the better picks into Ashe. Same with MF to a degree. So again, raises up like these other picks a lot more. And then in support, like I said, we had Rel as a huge premier pick. She got a little bit of nerfs. Same with Leona. And she's still she's still a very solid pick. It's not as like important to aim for that. And depending how things go, you know, we'll see how teams like go about their business. Right now, we see mostly Lucian Nami. And I don't think this is necessarily the best bot pick per se that people are doing, because we have things like Kalista, and people are definitely going to try some other options like the Draven. But Senna support, Lulu, these are not very picked right now. And so I'm very curious to see what direction goes with some of these like Enchanter supports. Because right now, yeah, it's still a bit melee dominant. But I feel like there's a slow approach towards like seeing some teams taking like Jinx, for instance. Like taking Jinx and taking... We haven't really seen any Zeri. I don't think we've really seen too many hypercarries outside of Jinx, actually. A lot of it has been pretty lane dominant and then a Jinx. But if you start going into enchanters and lane swaps more, then suddenly this becomes a little bit more interesting. And yeah, so that's there. Now, looking at what the actual matchups are, based on what we just talked about, BLG versus Mad. You know, we saw Mad games, right? And I think the main thing when you're looking at these teams is just naturally the top, whatever happened top lane is great for Bin, like really good for Bin. And that is not a good thing for Mern. And I think really when you look at these two teams, it's just going to depend on how Mad figures out their draft. Really, like they just need to find an edge in the draft with their picks, find something unique, some unique counter pick, and play off that and try to get like BLG off their game, because they have so many killer players. They have Bin, they have Knight, they have Elk. Like their three main laners, their core carries are all very capable at playing the game. For them, a lot of it lays onto him, Supa at times, and then just generally just playing the way they play, like playing together and doing their thing. That won't happen if you just fall apart across the board with lanes. So really, based on the meta, how it's like shaped up, I think for Eloya, being the playmaker, being the guy creating situations, he can find angles. He definitely can. And top lane is a little bit more opened up to where Mern could fish for some advantages. For Frescoe, I think he's just screwed because it is what it is with how the mid meta is. Like, you definitely need to outskill more in the mid meta now. And for Supa and Alvaro, these guys since the ERL days have been playing like very lane focused bot lanes. Like, that was always their style, was to win out in lane, find the level 1, level 2 advantage. So that is gonna be their big thing. And the thing is with the Chinese teams specifically for LPL, they didn't really lane swap. Like, this was not a huge focus when it was actually like even better than it is now. So for several teams, I'm going to be talking about this specific like macro point. And I think Mad, the way they played their lane swaps was kind of bad. Like, it wasn't even that great or perfect for how they did it. So they have to tune this up to make this better and get more out of it, while Billy has to kind of adapt and get like onto this point. And depending on how good they are at figuring it out will help decide how the early game goes. But since they have such killer, killer players and everything, regardless of whatever meta situations you can think of, there's no way Mad wins. For Test versus T1, I think a lot of this is going to stem from the fact that they have to figure out the bot lane meta. Like, Zeus, again, with top lane like opening up a little more with the Rumble ban, or with like the Rumble being weaker, it's good for Zeus for a variety of picks. He was the kind of guy who would blind pick Camille. Like, Yone is of course a fantastic pick for him that he will take, that he will play. And he's literally excelled on it and won them the 5th game for their Worlds qualification. And for 369, he just kind of needs to be a rock. You know, he just needs to figure out what's ideal to just hold on the fort, Renekton being a big priority pick for them. Same with Cassante, and play it off from there. With Tien, he's still a flipper. You're not 100% sure exactly what performance he's going to give, but the meta is more ideal for players like that compared to before. For Owner, he can play either style, but there is an edge in meta for top for going that direction. Now, Cream, he might end up just be playing like the Kali and like maybe some other melee options per se. For Faker, it's a net buff, right? We're playing a mage meta. We're going back to Ori, Syndra, these kinds of things. This is definitely a net buff for Faker compared to like what he had to do before. And for Cream, like I said, it's like so-so. It's fine. This is a good buff for him, right? Push this up. For 369, this is not necessarily the best. For Zeus, it's good. For him, again, doesn't matter entirely. For Guma and Kyria and Jackie Love and Maiko, like, I guess the main thing that we're going to really figure out, and like I said, is this whole bot lane meta. Because these two teams have very capable, very lane dominant-esque views on how to go about it with their picks specifically. Not just like how they always play the bot lane, but like their picks, they are very willing to do like strong counters that make the game like unplayable at times. So we just have to, like, if forever you see it, you're betting on this game or something like that, you need to make an executive decision on how this will go. You must figure that out. And also, again, they have an advantage with lane swaps because it was not a super common thing in LPL. T1 did have to deal with those situations a bit more. And the meta in the bot lane does favor them probably a little bit, outside the fact that if Lucian Nami really is good, yeah, he has a killer Lucian. They have a killer Lucian Nami, which I would be really afraid of. So for now, for me at least, if I'm looking at this matchup, it's a... Wow, that is not what we want. For me, this is a favor towards T1 only because we don't know 100% if Test is adapted for the lane swaps, and for how the meta is changing in both in top lane and in mid, it's a favor to T1. Now, for Weibo versus Gen.G, honestly, I could go into it, but generally, it should just be a Gen.G win. They have very capable players playing like anyway. To be honest, Keen could play a lot of different champions. Same with Canyon. Same with Chovy. Same with Pays. And at the end of the day, they're just a solid team. With Weibo, based on what I saw from the World's Qualifications match, yes, they do have capable outplays, but probably the worst aspect is just that their macro is just not nearly good enough to compete against Gen.G. That's just the main issue. Like, their macro's not nearly good enough, and I do think their lanes at times just fall apart from random mistakes. And I mean, these guys are just that good. So this feels like a pretty simple, like, nod. Now for Fnatic versus Damwon. This will be interesting. So, where is Fnatic? Here we go. So for them, you know, Showmaker, again, he's the kind of guy who will play a lot of different picks. He will always choose like the new, more improved, interesting situations. And Lucid is the kind of guy who was most known for his Vi, really known for his Vi. And this was like almost always permaban for him. But if the junglers are kind of similar to like how this playstyle is, and also he is a fantastic Kha'Zix, which this pick to me should raise in priority. Since in the end of the day, if we're gonna pick a lot of AD junglers, you know who counters them? Kha'Zix. Like, I know a lot of people think of Viego as like that guy, that pick, but Kha'Zix like absolutely ruins the day from champions like Jarvan, champions like Xin Zhao, and we do see a little bit of uptick of Nocturne with certain combos as well. And this may open up even more interesting mid picks that are like more playing for jungle and combos, like we've seen like the Nocturne Ori. But I think the meta is actually going in a good direction for Lucid. I think it's a good direction for Lucid. And for Kingen, he's kind of continuing just doing what he does. And Oscar, it's not consistent. I think that's the main issue I have, is like Oscar's just not consistent on both how he abuses the meta and then also how he plays. If he can get on top of it, that's cool. But for now, to me, like, this is like whatever for Kingen. He'll just do always what he always does. I think for Showmaker, you know, he has a very solid like control mages, so he's chilling. For Humanoid, honestly, it's probably a benefit to him for the meta again, because like these picks are more lane focused and can tie a little bit better with your junglers, especially if the junglers are like more active. And I think again, this is good for Razork. Like, I think for mid jungle wise, this is a meta that's both good for them, right? And then for the bot lanes, you know, I guess my main worry for them is always like people always view the mental of Noah. Is it good enough? Can it hold? Not 100% sure. You know, he has to really raise to the level and deal with like his demons. And with his picks, Aiming is coming off a very good split. A really good split. So I feel like he could just play whatever they want. And regardless of whatever the meta is, I feel like there's just an advantage in balling. And it is what it is. So even though I feel like whatever's happening top and happening mid jungle is actually like pleasantly like the same, this balling difference will probably be the main thing that decides it. And so Damwon gets a favor. TL this one is interesting to me because this would be way more focused on, well, two things. One, I think this meta is not nearly as good for APA. I think mages are the type of champions who do not want to instant push, insta crash all the time, like some of these picks like he was doing on Corki, Trist. Like when he was playing these champions, he just got pushed a lot. Like he would just aim the play for push and just like do his own thing. You can't do that on mages so much because their mana resource is more important. And naturally, if you're just auto shoving, but also getting poked out by the other mage, if you get even just like wiggled out, like outspaced in lane, and you have this cooldowns that you always play on, because you're not playing on the auto so much, you're mostly playing on like the cooldowns, that's going to be a big problem. A big problem. Now, the upside is that maybe they'll like go to things like Asol. Maybe we'll go back to things like Asol. We still play a lot of Ziggs. Maybe we go to... Maybe he does want to play a pushing style with like Syndra. Or maybe he goes into the Ahri. You know, it really depends on like how they want to go about this. but there's gonna be a big focus for them on playing the mid jungle. Mid jungle will be a huge thing for this entire like Worlds event in the first place, but I think this is not necessarily the best meta for APA unless he can, you know, figure out how he wants to go about it, because he doesn't have a Yone, which sucks. And I don't think Impact has a Yone either. So we're down one of the best AD pick already. And Trist is not... Corki took a severe nerf. And Trist is not actually the best blind pick, because there's a lot of champions you can take into it now that do fine. So he has to like depend a little bit more on these, and I don't know how good that's going to be. For Scout, he's chilling. For Scout, he's like ecstatic. You know, he can play all these picks, and he has the Akali, and he has the Yone. Like, he is hard chilling. He is in a really good spot. For Impact, it's fine. I don't think there's like any major difference. I think they could go into some more interesting champions options. For Umpty, it's a better meta for him to get away from like these clearing junglers for sure. For Weiwei, it's great. Seriously, it's great for him. For Zika, it's like whatever again, not like the biggest deal. For Gala and Hong, I think there could be some very, very interesting stuff, and I feel like this is the same thing with Tess and with Tess and T1, where for however the meta like lands, I feel like Yan and Corki are definitely the types to do something wild. For instance, if we're going into like more ranged support meta, like if that's how things shape up, they're the kind of team who will play Samira and like Tarek. They'll play Neela. Like, there is some really good picks depending how things go that they can take and gain a significant advantage over other teams, even if they're not as good as a bot lane core. Gala's just a good player, generally. He's just a good player. And they have 2 killer players on their roster. And I guess, in the end of the day, if it goes to standard, it's going to be hard. Like, they will need some kind of draft advantage in bot lane. And Umpty needs to really be on his game. Like, he must really be on his game. Same with Impact. And maybe they have a chance. And I think specifically, I think T1 can win if there's a lane swap. If there's no lane swap, then I think it's LNG for sure. Because at the end of the day, I doubt they're going to be able to compete in a no lane swap situation. But in a lane swap situation, I feel like these guys are just not nearly going to be as prepared or like as well-rounded. And that's where they can get an advantage. And of course, you know, we may end up playing standard matchups. And that's where the draft is going to go. But for now, that's how I'm going to view this. This will fully depend to me on whether it's a lane swap or not. For HLE versus PSG, you know, let's be honest. Honestly, I don't even need to go through that, do I? For HLE versus PSG, I think PSG is a clear team that has its advantages, disadvantages. I think Ozzy can do well, but I think he does well when he plays against guys at a lower level than him. That's not going to be the case versus HLE. You know, Doran is like one of those very funny top laners where at times, you know, he's like inconsistent. He will have like a rough game and things like that, but he can turn it on and deal with the majority of the top laners in the tournament. And for Ozzy, it's just not going to go that way for him. Compared to like the other teams he's been playing in the play-ins, it's just not going to go their way to have that advantage that he usually has. And you know, Maple, I guess he'll try his best to do okay. Like, if you look at these teams, and I probably should show this anyways. If you look at these teams, like, it's a great, oh my gosh, that is not what you want. For these teams, it's a great peanut meta. You know, it's a great peanut meta. You know, there's a lot of melees that are going to be excelling. For Zeka the play, that's really good. For Viper, there's plenty of options for him as well. You know, there's no complaints. They're just going to play everything they can. And for Doran, funny enough, it kind of is good for him too, because like if he likes playing a lot of picks, it might be that kind of meta in top. Maybe he won't get as much usage, compared to some other players at times, but it's definitely not a bad Doran meta. So they have a lot going for them compared to PSG. You know, I don't think he plays nearly as many same picks. This really needs to stop happening. He doesn't play nearly as the same amount of picks. Gen.G, it's not necessarily like, it's like not nearly as good for him, to be honest. For Maple, it's actually not bad. And if they wanted to play that route, they could, but it's not nearly as good for Gen.G compared to before. And for these guys, it's just a standard meta. There's nothing really changes for them. So all in all, you know, we should see a more favored meta for HLE, and that gives them a clear advantage. For GAM FlyQuest, you know, I think it's pretty easy to just be like, well, GAM will lose. I mean, like, how are they going to win, right? Top meta, it opening up and Rumble taking a nosedive is good for Weibo. Now, if other carry top laners get picked, that may become a problem. But I think generally having the Rumble take a hit is good for Weibo. For Inspired, he has a really good Lee Sin, like playmaking wise, but the meta is not nearly as good for him as compared to before. So it's just kind of like, oh, whatever, change for now. They have to figure out how they want to go about it. If they're going to play things like Hecarim, you know, or like Viego, and like focus still on these farming junglers while being 80. For Quad, it's good. Honestly, I think it's good. I think him playing mages is probably more beneficial to him in many ways. For Masu and Busio, I think these guys are in the same realm as the guy. And again, they're not nearly as good as Jackie Love and Maiko or Gumayusi and Kyria, right? But they are the kind of guys who will whip out picks. And I think, again, depending how the bot lane meta shapes up, this could be a net gain for them, right? So overall, I think there's definitely some net gains for FlyQuest. It's just going to be the jungle thing that's going to be interesting, because last time in MSI, Inspired... Oh, and Wukong is also a very solid pick for Inspired to pick, to have, right? So there's definitely some good picks for them. They did even play Jarvan before he got buffed, though how well they will adapt to that style really depends. But it's not like just like a clean, like everyone's just getting a net gain for FlyQuest. For GAM, yeah, like naturally, like, you know, more stuff happening and everything is good for them. And I think Rumble taking a hit is also good for Kia. So I think it's a good gain for him and gain for Bwipo. But the team is just... The way I view NA teams right now is Fly is very similar to more of like an LCK team and how they like to play. Then TL is more similar to like a LPL team, and then like G2. They're more similar to like this. And then you have 100, who is pure NA talent. Strategy. That's how they are, right? And this is not a good playstyle for GAM to play against. Generally, it's not a good playstyle for them to verse. So regardless of like some advantages that, you know, GAM and FlyQuest gain, it should just be a FlyQuest win. Like, I don't see why it would not be a FlyQuest win. And then for the same sake, you know, it should be a G2 win over Pain, even though Pain may be capable of having a good early game at times, like something that Fnatic was able to do over G2. The idea that they will be able to out macro, especially in the games that we watched that Pain played, to out macro their opponents and like finish things off before G2 can literally outmaneuver them in sides, which they will do, doesn't seem too likely. So I think finishing this all off to look like the way we want to look at, you know, I'm just going to put LS because this is what it's just going to depend on. And I feel like a lot of my picks look pretty boring. And I think that's pretty standard to just assume like, oh, you know, the LCK, the LPL team are going to win, you know, especially like when you're playing against a tier 2 or whatever. And yeah, that should be the expectation for the most part. But my big interest for this day is TLLNG. I'm interested in T1 Tess. And I think that's about it. I know people are going to say Damwon Fnatic, but I And I definitely can see that because Zamon's not exactly the most perfect team. But I feel like there's just a lot of this, like, a lot of this intro day is going to depend on how these mid jungles operate with this meta. And then specifically, what is the bot meta? Like, what is the actual bot meta? Like, this will for sure be important for how, like, things are going. But, like, what is the actual bot meta? What is the true bot meta? I don't know yet. And so that's what we're going to find out. Well, I'm excited for the first day, guys. And we're going to keep going through each day and talking about this as it progresses. So let's get it. Thanks for watching, everyone.